Hello, and welcome to this virtual event hosted by Upper House, a Christian study center located on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Dan Hummel, your host, and on staff at Upper House. Our guest today is historian David Swartz. David's new book, and the basis for our conversation today, is Facing West, American Evangelicals in an Age of Global Christianity, from Oxford University Press. There's a discount code if you'd like to buy the book directly from Oxford. I'll put that in the chat in just a minute, and that code will give you 30% off. The Q&A function is live today, and please send questions in for David. We've already received some questions through the registration form, so I'm looking forward to a vibrant Q&A time. Now, I want to reference two trends that will help set up this conversation. The first is that in the year 1900, 80% of the world's Christians lived in Europe and North America. More than a century later, nearly 70% of the world's Christians live outside of Europe and North America, mostly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This development has had implications for every Christian tradition, none more so than evangelicalism. A second trend is encapsulated in the futuristic sounding year of 2045, the year that demographers forecast the United States will become a majority-minority nation. Like the growth of global Christianity, this trend also has broad-ranging implications for evangelicalism. Both trends point not only to an uncharted future for evangelicalism, but to the complex past of American evangelical relations with other Christians in the United States and around the globe. And this is where David's book shines. His research is meticulous and his writing is clear and evocative. So with that, let me introduce David a little more formally. Asbury University, where he teaches American religious history, 20th century American culture, global religion, Civil War memory, and issues of war and peace. David has written numerous peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on topics ranging from Mennonite history to human trafficking. David also blogs regularly at the Anxious Bench blog, hosted by Patheos. David's first book is Moral Minority, the Evangelical Left in an Age of Conservatism, from 2012. And it was reviewed positively in the New York Times and Christian Century, among other outlets. And if I may say, was a pivotal book in the field of evangelical history when I was just starting grad school around 2010, 2012. David's latest book is, as I mentioned, Facing West, American Evangelicals in an Age of Global Christianity. So David, thank you for writing the book and for joining me to discuss Facing West. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here, Dan.
Now, it's a bit early for published reviews of the book, but David, it does have 2 5-star reviews on Amazon.
Okay.
And so user Chris Tower concludes his or her 5-star review with the endorsement that Facing West is, quote, essential reading for anyone interested in religion and politics beyond an American-centric perspective. So there you have it. The internet has spoken, and it has spoken in favor of Facing West. In all seriousness, I'm sure it'll review well. Let's just get right into it. The first question I want to ask you, is there a particular moment or story or anecdote that you can point to that made you interested in this topic? You're a historian, of course, so this is a historical topic, but why this particular topic of American evangelicals and global Christianity?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a particular anecdote, but I do think it may stem back to my childhood kitchen, actually. When I went to my grandparents' house on Sunday afternoons after church, I find myself eating a lot of casseroles made German style with lots of beef and butter. But when I went home, my parents would make really exotic recipes from a cookbook called More with Less. And that's a book that I analyze at length in Moral Minority. And obviously it's a cookbook full of recipes. But before the recipes appear in the book, there's actually an essay that starts the book. It sort of describes the theology of the kitchen almost.
Mhm.
Um, and it is full of global influences, mostly of white Mennonite Central Committee workers going abroad to do humanitarian work. And so I grew up seeing that essay at the beginning and then eating really exotic dishes from the Philippines, from China, from Nicaragua and India. And so, I mean, there's some obvious questions that emerge from this. Where did this come from, and how did it appear in my conservative Mennonite kitchen? And the obvious answer is that it reflects the influence of global Christianity.
Fascinating. So that might be one of the maybe unexpected ways to think about what you write about in the first pages about a global reflex that develops between American evangelicals and evangelicals in the global South. And so I think you already sort of are on the way here, but can you explain what you mean by the phrase global reflex?
Yeah. So most scholarship on white evangelicals focuses on what they do to and for people around the world. And really, that's how it should be. There's a reason why American imperialism is studied so much. It's a true story. It's a sad true story that many Americans and many American evangelicals have dominated the world militarily, culturally, theologically, politically. And that's the story that needs to be told over and over. But it's also a true story that American evangelicals have been shaped in return in these interactions around the globe. And so when I use the word reflex, I'm kind of talking about a bounce back, a boomerang, a reflexive action. Just a simple acknowledgement that American evangelicals have been shaped by global encounters.
Hmm. So maybe, and getting maybe a little more concrete about that, you begin the story, the book, with the story of Kyung-Chik Han, a Korean pastor who came of age in the 1920s, really lived through every phase of modern Korean history and died in 2000. He was an immensely influential Korean Christian, as you depict him, but we really don't hear much about him in American history or American evangelical history. And the stunning sort of reveal you make at the end of your story about him is that he was a co-founder of World Vision, which is one of the biggest evangelical organizations working right now today. And we often, I think, associate the founding of World Vision with one person, Bob Pierce, the sort of original CEO and face of World Vision. So why don't we know as much about a pivotal figure like Reverend Han, and why is he so important to the story you're telling about this global reflex?
Yeah, great question. Pastor Han, as he was called, is a perfect symbol of this reflexive phenomenon that I'm trying to track in Facing West. He grew up in a small town in Pyongyang in Korea, and shaped by American missionaries and by a revival movement that swept through Korea in the 1900s. And that revival turned Pyongyang into basically a holy city of Korean Protestantism. It's really hard to imagine or believe it now, but before Pyongyang was the capital city of an atheistic North Korea, it was the spiritual capital for most of Christian Asia. So that's the environment that Pastor Han grows up in. And he is kind of pegged early on in his life as a very talented young man with a lot of potential intellectually and spiritually. And so church leaders in Korea send him to some of the best schools in Korea. And then they actually handpick him and send him to the United States, where he studies at Princeton Theological Seminary under the noted fundamentalist theologian J. Gresham Machen. So far, the story sounds like a very colonial story, right? But here's where it gets interesting. America is then shaped by this relationship. It's not just America shaping him. So after Han returns to Korea, he becomes a very prominent Presbyterian pastor. He survives the brutal Japanese colonization of Korea in the 1930s and 1940s. And then after World War II, he survives the brutal communist regime in North Korea before he flees to Seoul, which was in the American sphere at that point. And this is where his kind of organizational talents and leadership really blossom. He starts schools, food distribution centers, a political party, funeral homes, and dozens, if not hundreds, of humanitarian initiatives, mostly to help the millions of refugees that are fleeing North Korea. And his Korean colleagues talk about him in some really touching ways. They describe his beautiful soul, but they also describe how he was this bureaucratic force of nature. And they're just amazed at how this kind of humble pastor from the north, I mean, the church he was pastoring was on the border of Korea and China. And this humble pastor in a mid-sized Korean city ends up building this humanitarian empire in Seoul. But as you mentioned, a man named Bob Pierce gets all of the credit. I'd never heard of this guy before I started my research on Facing West. In 1950, when the Korean War began, Pierce was there and he saw the devastation. He starts handing out thousands of dollars to orphans, to giving them to schools and Korean pastors so that they can continue their work. Eventually, Pierce kind of settles into a program of orphan sponsorship, which is what they have become famous for. And the growth of World Vision is astounding. In the mid-1950s, World Vision had about 240, 250 sponsorships of children. By 1990, that number had risen to about 1 million. And then if you fast forward to today, World Vision is now the 11th largest charity in the entire United States. And it has annual revenues of over $1 billion. So the American narrative is that Pierce, the presumed founder of World Vision, was the force of nature that made that happen. That's the story you hear if you grew up in the United States. But if you're looking at it facing west rather than facing east, Bob Pierce's rescue of Korean Christians looks really, really different. So before Pierce ever set foot in Korea, the foundation had already been laid for the construction of World Vision. Han, as we know, because he went to the United States, is fluent in English. He's already a distinguished churchman. He's already coordinating relief work. He's networking with established contacts around the world, including the United Nations. And so when Pierce shows up in Seoul in March of 1950, you could say that Han takes notice of this energetic, entrepreneurial evangelist and discerns how Pierce might be able to contribute to the cause, especially through fundraising. So it might be accurate to say that Han discovers Pierce as much as Pierce discovers Han. Han certainly interprets for Pierce when Pierce gives sermons all throughout Korea, and the Americans incessantly note this, that Han is Pierce's interpreter. But this did not in any way mean that he was the subordinate in the relationship. Han is pretty much organizing everything. If you really think about it, there's no way that Pierce, who doesn't know Korean, who really doesn't know anybody in Korea before he sets foot in the country, and he's there for a grand total of just 2 weeks before the Korean War breaks out, there's no way he could have launched World Vision by himself. So the bottom line is that Pierce is plugging into an already existing humanitarian network built by Han. It's really a terrific example of the global reflex that I'm trying to describe.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing the details of that story. I think there's a picture you have in the book of Han and Pierce sort of standing together. And one of the points you make is that for most Americans, if they were to see Han, they would see him in this interpreter role. And so it would be like, and not to diminish interpreters, but it's like, oh, that's the person who's just translating the actual sort of person we want to be seeing. Mm-hmm. And so for Americans, like even the imagery and the way it's talked about is sort of diminishing Han's role in the story. And I think, it's just a perfect example of the story is different depending on where you sit and where you're and who you talk to. I think you talk about sort of being surprised by talking to Korean Christians and they sort of know this guy's a household name.
Yeah, that's right.
And none of us do over here in the United States. So
Yeah,
This might be a,
we really don't have much of a capacity for multiple stories, and that's exactly what this is.
right.
You've probably seen this TED talk by the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie, and it's entitled The Danger of a Single Story. And in it, she describes what it was like for her to come to this elite college in the United States and how her American classmates had difficulty really comprehending her existence out of what they saw as this poor, benighted Africa. And so she ends it by saying that the danger of a single story is that a dominant narrative can stereotype and ultimately disempower. And I think that's what's happened in the received narrative of world vision that we have. And I don't mean to diminish Bob Pierce in all of this. He was an amazing entrepreneur. He was active. He was a very gifted fundraiser. And I don't think that World Vision would have taken off without him either. But as we tell the story of evangelicalism globally, we have to include both of them and their relationship collaborating together. They had deep respect for each other. And Pierce asked Hahn to be the main preacher at his own funeral in California, I think in the 1970s sometime.
Fascinating. Well, this might be a good place to delve into a bit of the historian's craft. Already talking about narrative. Just give us a sense of the research you conducted to put together Facing West and the way you went about conceptualizing how you'd organize that in the book.
Yeah, so I begin with a couple of chapters setting a baseline that I call Christian Americanism. And it's how white evangelicals narrated themselves, how they were in strong pursuit of spiritual liberty for the world, political liberty for the world, economic liberty for the world. The middle part of the book is about this global reflex that we've been talking about. What are the ways in which American evangelicals were shaped by missionaries going abroad? And so there are chapters in that section on race and the civil rights movement, on the move from relief to development work. And again, that is more material on World Vision. There's a chapter on sexuality, on the supernatural, a couple of others as well. So I organize each chapter around an opening episode and then kind of go broad from there and showing how this was operative in whatever way it was in a more global sense. I remember when I began the project, a missionary friend of mine in China advised me to spend as much time as I possibly could abroad. And I mean, I'm constrained by money and time and by family obligation, but I tried to do that as much as I possibly could. So I was grateful to get a sabbatical from Asbury, and so our family spent 4 months in Cambodia and in Thailand over the course of a couple of years. And that's where we studied the American anti-trafficking movement and how that has been shaped by its activities in Thailand and Cambodia. I also remember the story of how I heard about the story of Pastor Hahn. I went to Seoul, and being there was just so instrumental. I was on the 8th or 9th floor of World Vision Korea's headquarters on Yeouido Island in Seoul. And I had gotten an interview with Jong Sam Park, who had just retired from the presidency of that organization. And so I was peppering him with questions about Bob Pierce. And he kept wanting to talk about this Kyung-Chik Han fellow that I had never heard of. And so I kept changing the subject back to Pierce. And he finally got pretty exasperated with me and said, "You do know that Pastor Hahn was one of the founders of World Vision." I said, "What are you talking about? I don't know who this is." He said he founded the whole thing. And he said it with a lot of intensity to this kind of young American historian that seemed to just want to tell a story of American triumphalism. So that night I went back to my hotel room and looked up the dissertations that had been written about World Vision, and Hahn wasn't mentioned in any of them. He had just disappeared from American memory. And so it was just crucial that I was in Korea, that I pursued the story, there. And boy, I can only imagine the fascinating stories that could have emerged if I had been actually able to go to the other places that I describe in my book. Like, what would have emerged out of the Philippines or Uganda or Guatemala?
Yeah. You know, there's a sort of, you just sort of described one of the patterns or cycles of doing historical work, which is having a thesis or some understanding of what happened, and then getting annoyed when sources and people start bringing in people who you're like, no, that's not part of the story. And then you get to go back and do the exploration and the discovery for you, not discovery for other people who know more about the, a truer version of the story. So that sounds great. Just thinking more about the book and where the key plot points are in Facing West. One of the key points, maybe the key point, seems to be the Lausanne Conference on World Evangelization, held in 1974 in Lausanne, Switzerland. And you call the conference, quote, the most important evangelical gathering of the post-World War II era. And you also describe what happens there as, quote, the chastening of America from many quarters of the majority world. So could you outline for us just sort of what this conference, I'm sure a number of people have heard of it, but maybe don't see it as this really big turning point in the story of global evangelicalism. But even more than just tell us about the Lausanne Conference, maybe even back up a minute to explain why conferences like this are so important to the history of evangelicalism. It's sort of unique, I think, to evangelicals to have these major conferences that become turning points. So what is Lausanne, and sort of what's the purpose of conferences? What's the role of conferences in evangelicalism?
Yeah, Lausanne was a congress convened to discuss methods of missions. And it was significant because for the first time within the neo-evangelical movement, it brought together evangelicals from all around the world to have a conversation. It wasn't just an American conversation. So there was actually a predecessor conference to Lausanne in 1966. It was held in Berlin, Germany, and it kind of helps set a baseline. It gives a helpful contrast to Lausanne. Now at Berlin, we see the beginnings of a challenge. Dissenters are beginning to find each other across continents, and they're beginning to collaborate. And a few Asians, a few Africans and Latin Americans begin critiquing the inability of the West to rigorously address problems of racism around the world. They're starting to push white American evangelicals to embrace social justice as a missional activity. On the other hand, these sensibilities are fairly easily suppressed by the organizers. And in fact, some of the non-white delegates who appear as if they might become a threat at Berlin are excluded from even attending. They're not invited in the first place. There are accusations of this. So given that piece of things, and then also the location, which was Berlin in the middle of the Cold War, it takes on a pretty strong Cold War vibe. American democracy, American capitalism, Christianity, these are all things held up as paragons of virtue, and Marxism is viewed as the opposite. It's a really, a dualistic construction. And so in the eyes of some non-white evangelicals, Berlin's a disappointment. Now, Lausanne feels different. It's held in 1974, about 8 years later. Compared to Berlin, Lausanne is enormous. There are almost 2,500 delegates that show up. Everybody who's anybody is there. The gatekeeping is a bit less intense, and it's really public. The world's most important newspapers are there covering the event. And white evangelicals can't hide or ignore the critiques anymore. And in fact, they're feeling kind of weak and vulnerable themselves. And that's because there's so many problems happening at home. So 1974 is the very end of the Nixon presidency. And so Watergate is just hanging over the entire proceedings. There's a big energy crisis at home, persistent racial crises. And by contrast, global Christianity is growing like gangbusters. And it feels like there's so many possibilities and so much vibrance abroad. It's the perfect post-colonial moment for this Congress to be happening. So on the third evening of Lausanne, a group of mostly non-Western delegates convene. They call themselves the Radical Discipleship Caucus. It's the meeting of the dissenters who have been invited to Lausanne. And I had the privilege of listening to the audio of that meeting, and it sits at the in the archives of the Billy Graham Center in Wheaton, Illinois, and it was just stunning to listen to that content. It began with a prayer. It began with a radical sounding folk song that could have come straight out of the 60s. And then the dissenters start to give these kind of extemporaneous monologues, critiquing the very event that they are at. The most vocal are a trio of Latin Americans, Rene Padilla, Samuel Escobar, and Orlando Costas. They're members of the Latin American Theological Fraternity. And over the next couple of days, a couple of them had been tapped to be plenary speakers at Lausanne. And Escobar especially just tears into Western constructions of Christianity. And let me read to you a quote from his speech. He accused Westerners of merely reproducing pagans or semi-Christians in their own likeness instead of really evangelizing. Like, imagine saying that out loud to 2,500 people, and one of those is the evangelical luminary, Billy Graham, sitting right in front of you. Escobar is accusing him and lots of other white Americans of preaching this kind of, well, preaching and embodying in some ways a stew of imperialism, of unregulated capitalism, and of racism. And they say, what about the humble, the radical gospel of Jesus Christ? You're right. This is a pivotal moment in evangelical history, and one that had lasting effects. If you think about what evangelical kind of discourse looks like now, you've got the evangelical left saying that social justice matters, and you have increasing numbers of the religious right even saying that social justice matters. Now, their methods are different, but they're both willing to say those things out loud. And I think that that is a fairly prominent legacy of Lausanne.
Yeah, that you definitely make that case. And one of the major figures that looms at Lausanne and in other parts of the book is John Stott, who is a British evangelical theologian and church leader, sort of the British Billy Graham, I guess, in a way. Yeah. But can you just, he's someone that I feel like Americans don't know as much as they probably should about the role John Stott played, and particularly played in this story about global evangelicalism. So can you just talk a little about John Stott and his role in your book?
Yeah, Stott is an Anglican priest, theologian from England, who really is quite a bit more globally sensitive than his contemporary from the United States, which would be Billy Graham. I mean, Billy Graham wanted to be empowering, I think. He paid for the entire conference. He's inviting everybody to have this big conversation, but he feels like he's losing control of the event, like Escobar is hijacking the Congress. And so he kind of retrenches and pushes to have language included in a document that is intended to be released at the end of the Congress. It's called the Lausanne Declaration. And so the language that he insists be in there is evangelism is primary. Stott is wanting a broader definition than that. He has spent decades investing in global evangelicals from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa, and he really wants their voices to be heard, both out of principle and I think because he agrees with them more than he agrees with Graham. And Stott ends up being the primary author of the Lausanne Declaration. And that means that he gives Graham what he wants, but he also includes a section on social justice that is longer than any other section in the Declaration. And so for global evangelicals, he is the hero of Lausanne. And to be honest, he can get away with it with the American crowd too, because he's got a cool like British accent and he's from C.S. Lewis land, right? There's a kind of a residual Anglophilia going on. And so Stott is perfect bridge between Billy Graham style white evangelicals and then all of these evangelicals of color from around the world.
Yeah. And that just as you're talking, just fascinating how even just an event like this, which is a complex event, but there's just so many threads coming through. It sort of sits at the middle of your book, I think. I think it's sort of in the middle section. And the conferences themselves, but also all the people that are empowered by these conferences, brought with them changes in theology and social political concerns that were different from the Christian Americanism of the first part of your book and from American evangelicalism. And there's so many ways we could sort of go into the different threads, and we just don't have the time to go through all of them. That's why people should get the book. Some of them that I found really fascinating: the rising influence of Pentecostalism on global evangelicalism, the new critiques of American evangelical theology as beholden to Western culture. I think you mentioned that was one that Latin American theologians in particular were leveling at Lausanne. The new movements of social justice all around the globe by evangelicals. The traditionalism, I guess you could say, of on sexuality and gender that many of these global evangelicals also had. So this is it's a huge tangle of issues. I think one of the great things you do in the book is you delineate and seek to clarify sort of how each one of these has a story and how they're developing over these decades. Could you just highlight maybe one salient thread of shifting theological and political priorities that's brought about by this global reflex and these changing demographics? Like, what's the one most fascinating or most influential of these threads or these trends or developments that you're tracking in the book?
Yeah. Maybe I'll take three of the threads that you just mentioned and weave them into a rope or something. The bigger rope would be the post-colonial logic that a lot of global evangelicals bring to their encounters with white American missionaries and humanitarians. So first of all, social justice. Global evangelicals say social justice matters, and that the global South has been the victim of global and social injustice. I mean, more than anybody, they are intimately familiar with how structures can work against them, how economic structures, political structures emanating from some far off place affect them very often, but not always, in negative ways. And so they make the critique that the West is sometimes complicit in creating unjust social structures. Second has to do with sex. They are saying that decisions about sexuality, including divorce, abortion, pornography, especially same-sex relationships, these are not matters that should be decided by individuals. So the case study that I used in the book was the Church of Uganda. And so Ugandans like Archbishop Henry Arombi say that individuals should not have free reign to do whatever they want, but it's this individualistic West that is complicit in forcing individualism on our church. And it's resulting in the unraveling of traditional sexual arrangements, and it invents new ways of kind of interpreting scripture. And so they make the case that, again, the West is encroaching, just like it did in issues of social justice. And then one of the other things that you mentioned, Dan, was the supernatural matters. Many global evangelicals insist that there is an active world of demons and angels out there, that miracles can happen. They should happen. In fact, we see miracles. We see angels and demons. We see an enchanted supernatural landscape all throughout the Old Testament, and then the New Testament, and then the early church, and then the rise of Pentecostalism, all the way until today. I mean, they are doing miracles themselves, they say. But the West, which comes out of historical context of Enlightenment rationalism, is complicit in diminishing, very often, the spiritual dimensions of reality. So all of these critiques are tied together by a post-colonial logic. It's It's a bit more subtle, perhaps, than the old style imperialism of the 19th century. But nonetheless, the West is trying to export their foreign values to the South and to the East. So quit trying to evangelize us in your own image, they say. Quit trying to civilize us by making us progressive on sexuality. And then they can always point to their numbers, right? The Church of Uganda has 9 million members. The equivalent Anglican body in the United States, the Episcopal Church, has a weekly attendance of only 700,000, even though America has, what is it, well over 300 million in its population. So not only do Ugandans resist what they see as Western imperialism, but they actually go a step further and seek to reverse mission. So instead of missionaries going from America to Uganda, Ugandans start to send missionaries to the United States, and they begin allying with conservative Episcopalians, even forming a new ecclesiastical body called the Anglican Church of North America, the ACNA. And for a time, there were very dark-skinned Ugandan bishops in authority over white American priests. Like, who could have imagined that 100 years ago?
Right, right. That's fascinating. And just on the supernatural part, I did research in Jerusalem, and this hit me once when I was just attending a Easter service with a Nigerian pastor, and the sermon was about the last person he had raised from the dead.
Yeah.
And it wasn't an analogy or a metaphor or just raise your feelings from the dead. It was like he literally was talking about the last person he claimed to have raised from the dead.
Yeah.
Just a few months before that. So, and yeah, to my American Western ears, it felt both sort of unbelievable in some way, but also like my faith was so weak compared to these people who are talking about raising. Of course, they're citing New Testament scripture and other things that they see as still sort of, they're in the same tradition as raising Lazarus from the dead and other things. So,
right.
Yeah,
that reminds me. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, that reminds me of my research in Boston, which is the last chapter on immigration. So my wife and I flew from Columbus, Ohio to Boston. It was a very early flight on a Sunday morning. And it was the only Sunday that we would actually be in the city doing this research. And so we got off the airplane, took a bus into downtown, and we found a Redeemed Christian Church of God congregation called the Cornerstone Miracle Center or something like that. And we still had our luggage with us. We show up at this church, and 80 sets of eyes turned toward us, and we're the only white people there. And by the time the service was over, we had been prayed for, hands on us, by dozens of people at a time, more intensely than it happened for years at the church we typically would go to. So it was a sense that the supernatural mattered, and that prayers would actually change reality in ways that I just didn't quite grow up thinking like that.
Right. Same here. Okay, well, we want to move just to the last few questions about the implications of all this. Maybe think for the audience in particular, think about our own situation and what to sort of think through about this. I did want to do a quick speed round of just some just questions for you. First thing that comes to mind, these are less serious, just giving like a full picture of the historian David Swartz for the people that are watching. So I'll just rattle these off. I will try not to follow up because then it's not a speed round. What do you listen to while writing?
Absolutely nothing. I used to enjoy the white noise of a coffee shop before I had kids, but we had 4 kids in 4 years, and I write in blessed silence whenever I can.
All right. When I say favorite restaurant, what comes to mind?
My months in Thailand always push me to Thai restaurants in Lexington, Kentucky now.
Okay, yeah. Okay, speaking of Kentucky, you're at Asbury University, that's in Wilmore, Kentucky. So just fill in the blank here. The most peculiar thing about Wilmore is?
It is a town that has a cross on its water tower, public water tower, which offends everything in my Mennonite Anabaptist sensibilities. And it is in the middle of a bluegrass region full of sin. It is the place of horse racing, gambling, bourbon,
Yeah.
and there's something else, but it is a holiness enclave in the truest sense of the word.
Okay. Okay, so here's the flip side. Fill in the blank. The most endearing thing about Wilmore is?
It is a small little village, and our kids roam it constantly. We don't know where they are, and lots of other people help take care of them.
Oh, that sounds charming.
Child raising by community. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite novel?
Yes. This is a novel about how a Berkeley anthropologist kills an American evangelical missionary. It's called Field Work by Berlinski. It sounds like an outrageous premise, but it is so empathetically written that it all seems plausible by the very end. Highly recommended.
All right. Well, there's another book people can check out. Do you have a favorite work of history? Or if not a favorite, what? I don't want you to have to offend anyone.
Yeah.
one of your favorites.
Dan, it's obviously your book. No, I really like the book, and this is actually not in my field at all, but I love the premise of it. It's called Liberty's Exile, I think, by Maya Jasanoff. It's about what happened to the British loyalists after the American Revolution. So I love studies that look at what happens to minority populations when they lose.
Right.
Fantastically done book.
Right. Okay, and then the last question. I listed off a number of things you teach when I introduced you. What's your favorite class to teach at Asbury?
Yeah, it's a class I don't get to teach very often, but it's called War in the American Memory. So we don't actually look at the wars themselves, how they went down, who won and why. We look at how those wars have, how the narratives of those wars have shifted over time. So it's a really fascinating way of looking at primary sources that include traditional historical works, but also songs, movies, poetry, statuary.
Right.
And so my students and I have a really good time with that, especially when we have our enormous Civil War section right in the middle of the course. Being in Kentucky is just a very rich place to be on those topics.
Yeah, I can imagine. Same here in Wisconsin, actually. There's a lot of Civil War. Our football stadium is called Camp Randall Stadium, based on a camp from the Civil War era.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's you. Once you get your eyes open to it, you see in a lot of places in the country how formative the Civil War was still for the landscape and the naming of things and all that. Yeah. Okay, I want to give a few minutes for questions as well, but I did want to wrap up and move into just a couple questions about implications. I think it's really clear that looking at all these different themes, all these different strands, the way that majority world or global evangelicals sort of where they align does not fit up easily into our conservative liberal binary in American politics. And so American churches have, and you document this, have responded differently to this global reflex, to the growing diversity within the church. So how should we understand the different American responses to the rise of global evangelicalism? If you were just to sort of paint in broad terms sort of what the big dividing lines are, sort of what the response of the American church has been, sort of how would you guide us on that?
Yeah. So politically, global evangelicalism really scrambles American categories. So if you think about American politics having this particular configuration of Republicans believing, and now this has been scrambled even more by Trump now, but of the Republican Party having a platform of small government, justice through individual relational action, a conservative sexuality, anti-abortion, anti-immigration, and so forth. And then the Democratic Party, by contrast, being more pro-immigration, pro-choice, progressive on sexuality. I mean, global evangelicals aren't convinced by either of those packages. And so if you look at Hispanic evangelicals, they flip back and forth in who they voted for in presidential politics. So in '76, they vote for Carter, then they flip to Reagan because of his amnesty bill, then they flip to Clinton, then to George W., and then back to Obama. But each alliance is fraught with all sorts of tension. And so one Boston pastor, he was the pastor of a megachurch called Lion of Judah. I mean, I think I would call him a Pentecostal social justice warrior. I mean, there aren't a lot of them in the United States, but there are a lot of them abroad, and quite increasingly since the Immigration Act of '65, there are quite a few in the United States, although they're not heard from quite as much. So the question is, how much have they shaped American evangelicalism? And I think here you have to make an important distinction between evangelical elites and evangelical populists. So when I began work in this book, I was convinced that cosmopolitan evangelicalism was the future, even that it was largely already here. So the president of Asbury Theological Seminary told me about the stunning growth of churches in New England in what he called a quiet revival. I read a lot of Christianity Today articles on the growth of global evangelicalism and the lessons that could be learned from them. I was working with a lot of never Trumpers at a Christian college. It really felt as if white evangelicalism was headed in a more moderate direction. And then it was being shaped by embodied interaction with majority world evangelicals. But it turns out that I was living in this kind of elite evangelical bubble. Somebody online called it the evangelical faculty lounge. And I mean, hanging out in that lounge gave me an unrealistic picture of what American evangelicalism was in reality. And so I never really saw the 2016 election coming, especially the 81% number. But I think it turns out that a lot of evangelicals are still invested in this old style Christian Americanism. I was really sobered by an article by James Guth, I think teaches at Furman. He's a political scientist and did some pretty fancy statistical work that I don't understand, but his finding was that evangelicals share with Trump a whole set of attitudes and policy positions. There's a fair amount of nativism, negative attitudes toward immigrants, an interest in practicing a nasty style of politics, an assertion of strong solitary leadership. So what Guth was saying is that they were voting for Trump as much as they were voting against Clinton. So my theory is that evangelical elites won the narrative war up until 2016. So back in the 1950s, these neo-evangelical luminaries like Carl Henry and Billy Graham really trying to clothe fundamentalism in more respectable garb. But the populists were there all along, I think. So for every Wesleyan suffragette, for every Wesleyan abolitionist, I mean, there were probably a dozen supporters of Andrew Jackson and slavery. And so when you look at the most prominent evangelicals of, say, the 70s and 80s, well, especially before the 80s, thinking of Graham, and more recently, people like Michael Gerson, George W. Bush's speechwriter, editors at Christianity Today, evangelical lefties like Ron Sider and Jim Wallace. I think they've all kind of functioned because of their kind of bully pulpit to make evangelicalism seem more respectable than it actually is. And I think that global encounters have shaped these elites more profoundly than they have shaped the populace. And that's actually exacerbated the divide. So there are multiple stories going on.
Definitely. Yeah, and you definitely in the last chapter and then the conclusion, the reader really gets a sense of that complexity. I just want to conclude on maybe a slightly more hopeful note. You talk about one of the promising signs of the global reflex is that at least some American Christians have begun to contextualize themselves. That's what you call it. And you talk about the inclusion of more diverse voices that has allowed Western Christians to see sort of the accretions of culture that have developed over the centuries. And you, as a nod to your own Anabaptist commitments, I'm pretty sure, you observe that contextualizing the West often leads to a rejection of Christendom itself. And so can you just briefly say what you mean by Christendom there, just for people who aren't familiar how you're using that? And then sort of what is the one thing, what's the sort of top shelf thing that you're hoping to see in the future for American evangelicals in relation to this global reflex?
Yeah, as an Anabaptist, I confess up front to a fairly cynical definition of Christendom as kind of a system of power exercised by the church, often allied with state power, used for both spiritual and political expansion. I think if you look historically, Christendom has often suppressed individual conscience. It's been used to justify the Crusades, to justify the doctrine of discovery, colonialism, slavery, in the 19th century Manifest Destiny. I mean, the book you need to read on this is called Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles, who's an indigenous person, and Soong-Chan Rah. Terrific book. Now, what you get when you contextualize Christendom and kind of read it historically to show it what it is or what it was, I mean, it helps us realize how much we read scripture through a historical lens. Our understandings of mission, of the supernatural, of social justice, of the military, I mean, it didn't just drop straight from the sky from God through scripture. Our readings of scripture come from a social context. And so I think when we read theology from at least some global voices, it helps us to recover themes from our sacred texts that I think can be more helpful and maybe better reflect the gospel. So I'm speaking specifically of themes of lament, of marginality, of pilgrimage, perhaps a missiology of peace. And so we need to have clear eyes as we look at white evangelicalism and as we look at it demographically. In the 20-teens, white evangelical Protestants had a median age of 55. In that same decade, the proportion of white evangelicals to the general American population dropped from 23% to 17%. That is a precipitous drop in just 10 years. And by contrast, as you opened up our conversation, the number of evangelicals of color from around the globe is on the rise. And that gives me a fair amount of hope that our categories as Americans can be scrambled in helpful ways. And it even makes me wonder, and this is probably too hopeful, and that's that demographic shifts may cause historians 50 years from now looking back on us right now and see the very tight coupling of kind of right-wing politics, theological conservatism, and social conservatism. Maybe the religious right will be seen as the outlier instead of the various ways that global evangelicals understand politics. Now, that's going to require evangelicals of color to continue associating with the movement we call evangelicalism in the United States. And whether that's possible or good is not yet clear to me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, David. I do want to give a few minutes here. We'll probably go a few minutes over 1 o'clock just to field some questions. First, a couple people have used the chat. A couple Asbury alums are in the room. Manahar James says, I think with a happy face, Wilmore is a holy city. And he's wondering if you are speaking from your office in your department, which you are. You told me that before the event. Another alum, Stephen Block, wondering who you took over for in the department. Is that who did you take over for, David?
Yeah.
I don't know. This is for Stephen only. I don't know if anyone else.
Yeah, I took over for a beloved professor of history here at Asbury called Ed McKinley, who was a Salvationist, actually, fit well here at Asbury, and he wrote one of the best histories of the Salvation Army in the United States. I can't remember the title, but you should read it. Yeah.
Great. Well, we have a few questions that people have submitted beforehand, and so I want to touch on a couple of those, and then we do have some Q&A questions from today as well. One, Daniel from Seattle. Hey, Daniel from Seattle. He's from Wild Leaders. That was one of the last people to come visit us at Upper House before COVID hit. How can American evangelicals best engage in the global work that you are describing? So, like, if you had a call to action for American evangelicals, and I'm thinking here probably of the white evangelical church, sort of what would be the thing you'd recommend people do to really handle this global reflex in the proper way?
Right. I mean, this is an obvious and general point, but I think it's really important to listen well. So world Christianity is a really big construct, right? I mean, you can find whatever you're looking for if you're trying, and it's tempting to do precisely that. So maybe a caution against just cherry picking what you already want to hear. So I see American progressives kind of dropping their post-colonial logic when Africans start talking about homosexuality, or when Latin Americans start talking about spiritual renewal in a Pentecostal sort of way. Conservatives do the same thing when they try to erect a spiritual canopy, right, for capitalism, homophobia, and American power. I mean, you get Americans on the left and right cherry picking global voices. What I think we need to do instead is listen really, really well, especially to global evangelicals whose contexts resemble biblical contexts, say more than my own. During my research, I came across a fascinating biblical exposition of Psalm 23 by a theologian named Hannah Kanoti. She's from the Gikuyu people in Kenya, and she wrote her analysis of Psalm 23 from the perspective of somebody who's familiar with refugee life, who's familiar with the rhythms of agrarian life, knew injustice intimately well. And so she talks about herd behavior, talks about techniques of shepherding, rural violence, learning to trust in God from that context. And the article clearly implied that a person living in such conditions could offer more biblical insight than, say, a 60-year-old white man from the American Midwest. Now, that's going to be me in 20 years, but I think her point is exactly right. I used to disc fields in the American Midwest for spending money as a teenager, but I was not ensconced in refugee life. I was not living the agrarian life in the same way that she was, but she was living that life in a way that most closely resembled the biblical character of David. And so I think it's really important to listen to the hermeneutical insights of people like that. We have so much to learn from Kanoti, from Young Hua, from Justo Gonzalez, from Amos Young, and so many others. I think that Asianness, I think that Latin Americanness, I think that Africanness in itself offers a kind of hermeneutical insight that somebody like you and I simply can't do. There's just so much more to learn, and what a waste to use global evangelicals to confirm what we already think.
Yeah. This is a historical question from Michael Goodman. What influence, this is something I think about a lot when thinking about evangelicals, what influence did Vatican II and liberation theology have on, we could think of, on the sort of global South evangelicals or Western missionary activity from the 60s onward? do you see sort of these other big, things we talk about, the reform in Catholicism and liberation theology? Do you see those playing a role in your story as well?
I rarely, if ever, saw any references to Vatican II, which is surprising now that I think about it. I do think that there was a strong effect, especially in Latin America, on this evangelical kind of theological group called the fraternity.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that Escobar, Padilla, Costas, and many others in that organization were touched by liberation theology. What they tried to do was combine the insights of liberation theology and retain a kind of evangelical theology. And so in that way, and then we already talked about the influence of that group on Lausanne, and then the influence of Lausanne on all quarters of evangelicalism around the world. So I think in that kind of domino effect way that it's had an effect.
Yeah.
But it is striking that Vatican II, I just didn't come across. There's a residual anti-Catholicism operating within evangelicalism into the 70s, I think.
Yeah. So my own research is in looking at evangelical Jewish relations, and Vatican II's statement on anti-Semitism is actually quite influential for the evangelicals who are caring about that issue. And even at the Berlin conference that we talked about in 1966, there's a big panel on missions to the Jews, as it was called at the time.
Yeah.
And you could see that was totally in the shadow of Vatican II's statement. So there was no like explicit invocation of Catholics. I mean, that was maybe a step too far, but there was a sense that evangelicals need to say something on this issue because the Catholics just said something on this issue. So that might be sometimes these things are maybe more coded or not as explicit as just like finding a keyword of Vatican II or something would be.
I think that's exactly right.
Okay, we're going to go for just about 5 more minutes to about 1:10, because there are just a number of good questions here. This one is from Robert in Madison. How does the move of the heart of evangelicalism to the global south, so the center of gravity, affect what we used to call foreign missions in America? So you think about, you mentioned it briefly, but maybe you could talk more about this idea that actually a lot of global evangelicals see America as a mission field in a way that for much of American evangelical history, Americans have seen the rest of the world as the mission field. So do you have any thoughts on that sort of concept of foreign missions and American evangelicalism?
Yeah. So at Lausanne, there were a couple of global voices that came really close to saying that Americans should quit sending missionaries out, and saying that in some ways you're doing more harm than good. And they really wanted to beef up other directions. And it includes east to west, as we already talked about. And Koreans have been really, really active in that way, especially in campus ministries, but also in planting daughter churches. So the church that Pastor Han started, called Yongnok Presbyterian Church, I think there are dozens of them in the United States now, including a very large one in Los Angeles. And so we're starting to see the emergence of a lot of reverse missions. But there's also a lot of like east to south and south to east and east to east and south to south. I mean, mission, as some missiologists are now describing, is going from everywhere to everywhere. And so it's hard to discern a lot of patterns anymore. And that's because there's more and more resources coming out of Korea. It's a wealthy nation. More and more evangelicals coming out of Thailand, more and more coming out of India. In my own Mennonite denomination, there are missionaries from Costa Rica going to Thailand to do missionary work. It's a fascinating new trend that I think will only grow as time goes on.
Right, and even those trends sort of also indicate how American evangelicalism might start fading in fading in the sort of importance of the story we tell about the 21st century or maybe the 22nd century or something, which I think is a development that Christians 50 or 100 years ago would have had a hard time imagining as well, right? Yeah.
And some still are having a hard time imagining it and being okay with it.
Right. Okay. Nick in Madison asked a question, and I don't know if you can get on the specifics of this. He asked about how Chinese evangelicals view American evangelicals versus Korean evangelicals. I don't know if you can speak to that specific difference between Chinese and Korean, but it does raise a broader point about the slipperiness of just using the term global evangelical to sort of capture most of human society, like most societies on the globe. So how did you think about that as you were even using that term to distinguish between even the continents? I mean, that's a really mass generalization, but how did you think about that when we're being so specific with American evangelicals and then we just sort of lump everyone else into this other category?
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem of what I think psychologists or sociologists call outgroup homogeneity. We like to see variety and complexity in our own group, right? And paint and stereotype everybody else as the global evangelicals or the East or the Thais. It's a real problem. And I mean, I confess to violating this principle throughout the past hour. We need to be super careful about how we use categories. What do we see as the center? I think my own excuse is that my subject is not global evangelicals as much as it is American evangelicals, but it's super important not to, I mean, what do we see as normative? Is evangelical just a shorthand for white American? I think that's what a lot of us imagine when we use the word. When Americans think about theology, they often think about it as constructed in Europe and North America, and then global theology is made everywhere else. Now, why do they have to have the adjective and we get the word theology? It's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think one way you deal with it in the book is by rooting the story in particular people from other perspectives. And so that gives, I mean, it's just both giving other voices, but the window into a different context through that, through Pastor Hahn or through a number of the people you talk to. So that might be one way to sort of try to be able to differentiate, even though all of us are limited and it becomes impossible at some point from any particular perspective. But
it's a lot easier when you're writing a book in a granular level and telling particular stories. When we have a verbal conversation like this and we're speaking in broad strokes, that's when we kind of fall into normative language that gets problematic.
That's right. Okay, well, thank you, David. I want to ask one more question, and this will be the last one. I'd encourage anyone who has there were questions that we didn't answer. David has a website, davidswartz.com, and it has his email on it, and you can reach out to him. And
please do.
And I just know as a fellow historian, it's great to hear from people who've read the book or are interested in reading the book. With these, I mean, there's just so much that doesn't even go into the book, right? That maybe people are curious about. The last question I want to ask is just give us, so what's one takeaway you hope readers of the book take away? What's the one line you would offer as the lesson or the sort of the piece of wisdom that all this, the research and the writing and finally the book that you want to convey to us?
Yeah, this is probably overly broad, but what I come away with after narrating stories that are simultaneously so true and different from each other is just how much of a construction history is. When I teach classes, I distinguish with my students between history and the past. So the past is what has actually happened, and I think that exists. But I think our ability to apprehend it is somewhat limited. And in the end, history is interpretive, it's perspectival, it's shaped by what facts are used, how they're ordered. And as we're learning during these Confederate statue controversies, history is not neutral. In fact, one of my next books is going to be a biography of a Confederate statue that stands in the courthouse yard of the Kentucky county that I live in. And the more that I learn about it, that statue did not fully represent history.
Mm.
That was a cultural construction, right, that empowered white people and disempowered Black people. And that's not unlike the received narrative of world vision that we got that empowers white Americans like Pierce and his descendants and disempowered Korean evangelicals that we never even heard about. Now, that's a negative way to frame all of this, right? It's a negative spin that really stresses the limits of what we can know. Although I think it's important to say it out loud. And the Apostle Paul does it, right? When he describes looking through the glass darkly. But it's also important to think about the happier gloss to it, which is that utterly unexpected and delightful narratives can emerge when we listen to new voices and when we look at the past through new lenses. And that's really, in the end, what I tried to do in Facing West, which is to tell a new story of American evangelicalism by analyzing it through a global lens.
Thank you, David. I am going to call a little audible here. There's a chat question. Do you have any more info about the Hannah Canote's Psalm 23 reflection? Do you have like a way that someone could Google that and get it or something?
Yeah. So her last name is Kinoti. So Google that in combination with Christianity Today. And if my memory serves, I think it was published in the year 2000.
Great. That was Barry who asked that. Barry, reach out to me through email or David if you can't find it. Well, thank you, David. This was a pleasure. For those viewing, we're going to close with a slide that has the discount code on it and where to check it out. I did see a chat from Andrea who said OUP website is having trouble with book orders right now. Do you know how long the discount code will be accepted? David, do you know how long the code will be accepted? I know.
No, I don't. I just got it a week or two ago, so it should still be valid.
Yeah, okay.
But I can check into that.
Okay. Yeah, and of course, having a book come out during COVID is always difficult with these shipping things and get the word out. So we'll just all be patient with that. But David, thank you for joining us. This has been a pleasure. Learn more about Upper House at upperhouse.org. And we look forward to having another virtual event in August. So go in peace, and thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. This was a lot of fun. Take care.